look at the wall closest to you right now. Just, pick a spot and stare at it for a second.
Yeah, just completely zone in on it.
Exactly. Now, if someone were to ask you what color that wall is, you would probably give a really simple one-word answer. You'd say, oh, it's white, or it's blue, or maybe it's just a very boring beige.
Right, because that is how we are trained to categorize things.
Yeah, you think you are looking at this perfectly flat, uniform block of color, but you aren't. What your brain is telling you is a flat color is actually a massive, infinitely complex lie.
It really is. It's honestly one of the most successful illusions that our visual cortex pulls on us every single day.
It's wild to think about.
It is, because we crave categorization. We want to label that wall as one absolute shade because, frankly, it takes less cognitive energy.
Right.
But the reality of what photons are actually doing when they bounce off that drywall and hit your retinas, well, it's entirely different.
And that illusion, right, that gap between what is actually there and what our brain processes, that is the exact battleground of modern digital design.
It's where all the magic happens.
Absolutely. So today we are tailoring this deep dive specifically for you, especially if you're someone just stepping into the world of UI and UX design. Your canvas is essentially a piece of completely flat glass in someone's pocket, and your job is to make them believe there is a universe of depth inside it.
Which is no small task.
Yeah.
To do that, we are breaking down the core design concepts from Chapter 11 of the book, Design User Interface.
Such a good book.
Oh, it's foundational. And this specific chapter focuses entirely on a design element that has been loved, deeply hated, and then resurrected as a foundational pillar of how we interact with technology. We are, of course, talking about gradients.
But before we even boot up Figma or Sketch, before we talk about hex codes or pixels, we really have to talk about that wall you were just looking at.
We have to ground it in reality first.
Right. The source text makes a really foundational claim right at the start. It basically says, look around. Nearly everything you see is actually a gradient. And honestly, when I first read that, my instinct was to just push back and say, well, no, it's not.
That's everyone's first instinct, yeah.
I mean, I looked at my desk and I thought, my desk is flat brown. My coffee mug sitting right here, it's flat black. But then I actually look closer.
It completely challenges our fundamental assumption about the physical world. Let's take that coffee mug as an example.
Yeah.
If it is just sitting on your desk, the side facing the window is being heavily bombarded with light.
Yeah, there's a literal bright spot on it.
Exactly. It might even have a stark white highlight where the sun is reflecting right off the ceramic glaze. But then as your eye moves around the curve of the cylinder, the black gets deeper, it gets richer.
Right, and then the back of it is almost completely dark.
Yes, on the back side, where the shadow falls, it is a completely different, much darker tone. And maybe the desk surface itself is reflecting a little bit of warm brown light back up onto the bottom edge of the mug.
So if I were to take like an eyedropper tool, like in Photoshop,
Right.
and just sample pixels from a photograph of my supposedly flat black coffee mug, I wouldn't just get one single hex code.
Not even close.
I'd get like 1,000 different mathematical shades of gray and black and brown and white.
You would. Flat color is an absolute anomaly in nature. It practically does not exist unless you are looking into a perfectly lightless void.
Which is terrifying, so let's avoid that.
Fair enough. But look at the sky, which we so casually just call blue. It is actually a massive shifting transition.
Depending on the weather, right?
The weather, the angle of the sun, the particulate dust in the atmosphere, the humidity, all of these factors create a continuous wash of color. It might start as a pale, almost white cyan right at the horizon, and then deepen into a rich, heavy indigo directly overhead.
I'm just trying to think of the evolutionary reason for why our brains do this filtering. Like, why do we take all that complex gradient data and just tell ourselves, oh, the mug is black? Is it literally just to save processing power?
That is a huge part of it, yes.
Because if we were constantly calculating the exact micro shadows on every single leaf in the forest, we might, miss the tiger hiding behind the bush.
What's fascinating here is that is a highly plausible way to look at human evolution and visual processing. Our brains are incredibly efficient prediction engines. But the crucial thing to understand is that even though our conscious mind filters the gradient out to just label it a black mug, our subconscious visual processing relies entirely on that gradient.
Wait, really? It relies on it?
Completely. The gradient, which is just the uneven distribution of light and shadow, is literally the only way your brain knows the mug is round. It's how you know it has volume. and that it occupies three-dimensional space.
Wait, so if I somehow magically stripped away all the gradients from my vision, like if I made the world perfectly mathematically flat in color, I wouldn't even be able to tell how far away things were.
You would lose an immense amount of spatial information. If you looked at a perfectly flat sphere with zero highlight and zero shadow, your brain would not process it as a ball.
You just look like a circle drawn on a piece of paper.
Exactly. It would process it as a flat circle, or perhaps even a hole cut out of the fabric of reality. We are biologically wired to understand depth, distance, and shape specifically through uneven lighting. Gradients are the most natural visual state for the human eye.
They tell us what we can interact with.
Yes, they tell us what we can touch, what we can grab, and fundamentally what might be a threat.
Okay, I am struggling with something here, though. If we are literally biologically hardwired through millions of years of evolution to understand and crave gradients, if they are the very language of physical reality, why did the entire global design community declare war on them a decade ago?
The great flat design purge.
Yeah, because biology doesn't just change in 10 years. If gradients are so naturally human-friendly, why did they become the ultimate symbol of, like, ugly, outdated digital design around the early 2010s? Were designers just being pretentious and trying to force a new fad?
It is really easy to look back and accuse the industry of mere trend chasing, but we really have to contextualize it within the technology of the time. The source text traces the timeline of UI gradients, and it is a massive pendulum swing.
Okay, set the scene for me.
If we rewind to the early 2000s, the Web 2.0 era, we see the absolute golden age of skeuomorphism.
Oh man, the leather-bound calendar apps, the digital bookshelves with the incredibly heavy mahogany wood grain. Everything looked like it was a literal physical object trapped inside your monitor.
Right, and in that era, designers used gradients aggressively because they wanted a digital button to look exactly like a physical gel-filled plastic pill. They just piled on heavy 3D effects.
Thick borders everywhere.
Thick borders, hard, stark drop shadows,
Yeah.
and these massive, harsh white highlights right at the top to simulate an overhead fluorescent light shining on the screen.
So they were basically trying to mimic the physical reality we just talked about. They were trying to give the button real volume. But why did it end up looking so bad to us eventually? Did we just get tired of clicking on gel pills?
We did get tired of it, sure, but more importantly, the hardware of the time was actually betraying the illusion. Think about the monitors we were mostly using in 2005.
Oh, they were terrible. Heavy, low resolution.
They were low-resolution displays with severely limited color depth. So if a designer asked a screen to render a smooth, natural transition from, say, a dark forest green to a vibrant lime green, the screen simply did not have enough pixels or available colors to make the math work.
So what did the screen actually do? Did it just guess the colors in between?
It essentially forced the transition into harsh, visible steps. In design, we call this banding. Instead of a smooth, atmospheric fade like you see in the sky, you would get literal, rigid stripes of color across your screen.
Oh, I remember that. It looked so artificial.
It looked incredibly cheap. The medium itself, the low-quality display, was actively breaking the biological illusion of natural light. It was essentially the uncanny valley for UI. The brain subconsciously knew it wasn't real light, and it rejected it.
So that completely explains the massive backlash. The source material notes that designers basically threw their hands up, declared gradients unfashionable and just bad taste, and ushered in the era of brutal, strict, flat design.
The complete opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah, no shadows, no highlights, just absolute binary blocks of single colors. We basically traded the messy, failed attempt at reality for this clean, unapologetic digital artificiality.
We did. And flat design was a necessary palette cleanser for the industry. It forced designers to focus on typography, layout, and visual hierarchy, rather than just relying on flashy gel effects to make an interface somehow work.
Right, you had to actually have good layout skills.
Exactly. But, as the text points out, absolute strict flat design has a critical flaw. It completely ignores that biological imperative we started with. When everything on a screen is perfectly flat, the user actually has to work significantly harder to figure out what is interactive and what is just background decoration.
Which brings us right to the resurrection. The text points to the release of iOS 7 as the massive turning point where gradients just came roaring back into the mainstream. But obviously, they didn't bring back the heavy, banded plastic gel pills.
No, thankfully not.
If I look at modern interfaces, gradients are everywhere, but they don't look anything like they did in 2005. I assume the technology just finally caught up.
Dramatically so. The introduction of Retina displays, OLED panels, and high color gamut screens meant that the hardware could finally execute the designer's actual vision. A modern screen can render a transition across millions of microtones so seamlessly that the human eye absolutely cannot detect the mathematical steps.
So the banding is just gone?
The banding is completely gone.
Yeah.
And with that technological barrier removed, designers could return to gradients, but this time with a philosophy of subtlety. Modern design has practically crowned gradients as the new colors.
Okay, so if a junior designer is listening to this right now, and they've got this historical context, the real question becomes, how do we actually use this tool today? Because we know we shouldn't just slap a gradient on something just because the screen can handle it.
Right, just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Exactly. What is the actual functional utility of a gradient in a modern interface? How does it practically help the person tapping the glass screen?
The source outlines two fundamental functional qualities. First, gradients create depth and define shapes on a 2D surface. And second, they catch and carefully guide the human eye.
Let's dig into that first point about depth. The text discusses finding a healthy mix between flat design and skeuomorphic design.
Yes, blending the two philosophies.
So flat design gives us that uncluttered, minimal, functional layout. But skeuomorphic design adds a human factor, because real people just prefer things they intuitively understand from the physical world.
We like familiar physics.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this with a hypothetical scenario. Let's say we're designing a smart home app, and we have a giant button on the screen to turn off the house alarm. If I design that as a perfectly flat, solid red rectangle, I am entirely relying on the user's learned digital conventions.
You are hoping they have used an app before.
Exactly. They have to logically know, okay, rectangles with text inside them on screens are usually buttons.
Precisely. You are forcing them to rely on abstract cognitive mapping. But consider what happens when you introduce a subtle gradient to that exact same red rectangle.
If I add like a lighter red at the top and a darker red at the bottom, suddenly I am hacking their proprioception. I am signaling to their brain, without them even reading the text, that this object has volume. It is slightly raised off the background surface.
Yes, you are providing physical context.
I am literally physically inviting their finger to press it, just on a subconscious level.
And that is the absolute magic of utilizing the Z-axis in digital design. A phone screen only physically possesses an X and a Y axis. It is completely, literally flat glass.
There is no physical depth.
None. The Z-axis, the illusion of depth of an object sitting closer to the user's eye or receding back into the background, has to be meticulously engineered by the designer. When you pair a soft gradient with a subtle drop shadow of the exact same color, you are explicitly clarifying the interactive nature of the element.
Because in the real world, an object that casts a shadow is an object that can be manipulated. If it's just painted on the floor, you can't pick it up. But if it casts a shadow on the floor, you can kick it, or grab it, or push it.
That is a fantastic way to phrase it. A gradient and a shadow make the element feel definitive and essentially friendly. It whispers to the user, hey, I'm clickable. It massively reduces the cognitive load required to navigate the interface.
You don't have to guess what does what. The physics of the digital lighting tell you before you even think about it. So we've established that gradients solve a massive usability problem by simulating physical interaction. But the source text then pivots to something that honestly blew my mind, because it moves completely away from usability and jumps straight into the cutthroat world of corporate identity.
Yes, the concept of owning color real estate.
It's so intense, the idea of gradients in branding.
This is perhaps one of the most difficult, frustrating challenges a new UI designer faces today. When you are tasked with creating a brand identity from scratch, you are confronted with a stark reality. Almost all the major, recognizable single colors are already entirely monopolized by massive tech giants.
It is so true. Think about it. If I tell you to picture a clean, trustworthy, slightly corporate blue, your brain instantly loads up Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn.
It's unavoidable.
If I say utilitarian orange, you immediately think Amazon. Green is entirely locked down by Starbucks and Spotify. If you're designing a new app and you pick a solid green, people are subconsciously going to expect a coffee order or a playlist to pop up.
Our brains possess incredibly strong color memory. It is actually an evolutionary survival trait. We needed to remember the exact shade of a poisonous berry versus a nutritious one.
And now that trait is just being hijacked by capitalism.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, today, that survival trait is hijacked by branding in a heavily saturated app market. We recall corporate shades with startling accuracy. You would never, for instance, mistake the light, airy, almost translucent blue of Twitter for the heavy institutional office blue of Facebook.
Never. So let's run a hypothetical for the listener. You're the listener. You've just been hired to design the UI for a brand new, totally disruptive tech startup. It's a social platform that connects local musicians.
Okay, a common scenario.
You look at the color wheel and you realize you have a massive problem. If you use red, it feels like YouTube or Netflix. If you use blue, it's Facebook. If you use green, it's Spotify. There are practically zero good-looking flat primary or secondary hues left that don't trigger a massive subconscious association with a monopoly.
The well is dry.
Right. So how do you carve out an identity?
The source proposes the gradient solution. A gradient acts as a highly specific visual fingerprint that is infinitely more complex than a flat color.
Because you are mixing things.
Exactly. By merging two colors, perhaps taking a highly popular trusted hue like blue, and bleeding it into a more unpopular or unexpected hue like a vibrant magenta, and doing it at a very specific mathematical angle, you create a defining characteristic.
A characteristic that cannot be easily confused with a solid block of corporate blue.
Precisely. It gives you ownership of a completely new visual space.
This is brilliant because it's basically finding a loophole in the finite nature of color. A flat color is a limited resource. There are really only so many of them that actually look good on a digital display.
There is a hard limit.
But a gradient isn't a color. A gradient is a mathematical equation. It is a relationship between 2 points. It expands brand identity from a tiny little sandbox of primary colors into an infinite spatial dimension of angles and transitions.
Let's expand on that idea of the mathematical relationship. You aren't just claiming blue as your brand. You are claiming the specific 45-degree soft transition from a cyan to a warm purple.
That's way more specific.
It is, and this allows a brand to evoke multiple psychological responses simultaneously. The blue grounds the brand in trust and reliability, but the transition into purple adds a layer of creativity, energy, and youthfulness.
And it creates proprietary visual real estate. If a competitor tries to copy that exact transition, it looks like a glaring, obvious ripoff.
They will get called out immediately.
Whereas if they just copy your flat blue, they can just claim, hey, it's just blue and nobody owns blue. A gradient is just a much stronger, much more defensible visual asset. Think about Instagram.
The rebrand.
Yeah, the moment they moved from that skeuomorphic brown leather camera icon to that incredibly vibrant, warm gradient, they completely redefined their identity. You see that specific mix of sunset orange and magenta literally anywhere on the internet, and you know instantly what app you're looking at.
Exactly. It was a masterclass in gradient branding. But to wield this power effectively, a designer needs to thoroughly understand the mechanical building blocks of the tool itself.
Right, you have to know how to build it.
The source text moves us into the actual mechanics of constructing these gradients, highlighting two primary types, linear and radial.
Okay, let's break these down because I really don't want this to just be high-level theory. I want the listener to understand what's actually happening in the software when they click these buttons. Linear seems to be the most common.
Linear is absolutely the foundational workhorse of UI design. It is, quite simply, a straight line transition. As a designer, you are manipulating three core variables: the colors you select, the transparency of those colors, and the angle of the line connecting them.
The text mentions horizontal, vertical, and diagonal lines. I assume horizontal means the transition moves straight from left to right. Vertical is top to bottom, and diagonal is usually a 45-degree angle.
That's correct.
And you can plot 2, 3, or even 20 colors along that straight line if you really wanted to. What about radial? How is that mechanically different?
A radial gradient completely discards the straight line. Instead, it operates from a single center point, radiating outward. You place your starting color in the middle of an invisible circle or ellipse, and the transition moves outward in all directions toward the outer edge, where your second color sits.
Oh, okay.
The text notes that radial gradients feel highly organic. They don't look like mechanical transitions. They look much more like natural light blooms. They are especially great for non-circular shapes where you want to create a hot spot of color.
Let's use some real-world visual analogies here to make this stick for the listener. Because staring at a little slider in Figma can feel very detached from reality.
Analogies are very helpful here.
If I'm using a linear gradient with a perfectly sharp horizontal transition between a dark blue and a light cyan, that's kind of like looking at the crisp horizon line over the ocean, right? The exact horizontal point where the heavy water meets the airy sky.
That is a perfect analogy for a horizontal linear gradient.
But a radial gradient is more like taking a little dropper of dark blue ink and letting it fall into a glass of still water. You get that intense, concentrated core of color in the center, and it softly, infinitely blooms and diffuses outward into the clear water.
Yes, a perfect diffusion.
Or, to go back to our earlier light discussion, it's like taking a flashlight and shining it directly at a flat wall in a dark room. The absolute brightest point is dead center, and it softly falls off into darkness at the edges.
Those analogies map directly to the special effects the source text explains. By manipulating the core variables of these two gradient types, you can achieve vastly different physical outcomes.
What kind of effects?
For example, if you take a radial gradient, so your flashlight analogy, and you apply two colors but you keep the transparency at exactly 0% on both ends,
Yeah.
you instantly transform a flat 2D circle into a 3D sphere.
Right, because you're giving the circle a highlight point, simulating that the center is physically protruding closer to the light source than the edges. It just pops off the screen. But what if I don't want a solid object? What if I want something to look like it's fading away?
Then you manipulate the transparency variable on a linear gradient. You can use the exact same color on both ends of the line, but you simply drop the opacity of one end to 0.
Ah, so it just dissolves.
Yes, this is the classic technique for creating a fade or a blur, where an image or a block of text appears to dissolve seamlessly into the background. It is incredibly useful for UI elements, where you want to show that there's more content to scroll down and see.
And what if I want the absolute opposite of a soft fade? What if I want a razor-sharp, aggressive line, like a hard split-screen effect?
You simply take the two color points on your gradient slider in your software and drag them so they occupy the exact same coordinate on the line. When the mathematical transition distance between the two colors is 0, you get a hard, solid edge.
That's super intuitive.
And conversely, if you push them to the absolute opposite ends of your shape, 180 degrees apart, you achieve the most fluid, elongated, and subtle transition physically possible within that given space.
Okay, so we have these incredibly potent mechanical tools. We can simulate 3D spheres, we can make solid objects fade into mist, we can create sharp horizons. But, and this is a big but, just because you can mathematically mix any two colors in the universe absolutely does not mean you should.
It's a dangerous amount of freedom.
It is. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the line between a beautiful modern UI and a chaotic early 2000s disaster is razor thin. So how do we actually govern ourselves?
We need strict rules of engagement. And the source text is very explicit about best practices here. The very first rule revolves around choosing the right colors to mix. The directive is straightforward. You should strive to match similar colors.
Similar in what way?
Mix warm hues with warm hues, like your oranges, reds, and yellows. Or mix cold hues with cold hues, like your blues, teals, and purples.
So I shouldn't try to mix a freezing icy blue with a boiling hot orange.
You generally want to avoid it, yes, unless you have a highly specific, artistic reason to introduce extreme visual tension. But the text absolutely warns against extreme clashes, specifically pointing out complementary colors. The most notoriously difficult mix is red and green.
Why is that, though? I mean, red and green are Christmas colors. They look totally fine next to each other on a holiday sweater. Why do they fail so miserably in a gradient?
It comes down to the literal math of the color transition. Red and green sit on exact opposite sides of the color wheel. When you ask the software to calculate the linear path from red to green, the mathematical midpoint of that journey passes through the dead center of the color space.
And what's in the center?
That is where colors entirely lose their saturation. So the middle 50% of a red to green gradient almost always turns into a muddy, desaturated, incredibly unappealing brown or gray.
Oh, that makes total sense. It's exactly like when you're a kid and you just mash all your vibrant Play-Doh colors together and you don't get a beautiful rainbow, you just get a sad lump of brown.
Exactly like that.
Nobody wants a sad, muddy brown button on their premium app.
No, they don't. And to prevent that kind of visual clutter, the text enforces another really strict rule. Stick to two colors.
Just two. But what if I want my brand to be incredibly dynamic? Can't I use a sunset gradient with purple, pink, orange, and yellow all mixed together?
You can. Perhaps in a massive illustrative background or a hero image. But for functional user interface elements, things like buttons, cards, navigation bars, two colors are more than sufficient.
It just gets too messy otherwise.
Yes. When you introduce 3, 4, or 5 colors into a single confined UI element, it stops looking like a natural trick of the light and starts looking like a chaotic tie-dye shirt. It becomes visually busy. It actively distracts the user's eye from the actual function of the interface.
Which perfectly sets up what I think is the most critical, profound sentence in this entire chapter. The author lays down a golden rule, and I want to read the exact quote here. Quote, "Subtle gradients between similar colors are perceived as the most beautiful."
That single sentence is the anger of modern UI design. And what requires deep analysis here is the psychological reason why humans perceive subtle and similar as beautiful.
Yeah, why is that?
It isn't just subjective art critique. It is deeply rooted in neurology and the concept of cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction. I really love that term. How exactly does a gradient create friction in my brain?
Your visual cortex consumes a massive amount of metabolic energy to process stimuli. When you look at an interface that uses high contrast, wildly different colors in a tight space, say a neon green slamming right into a hot pink, that transition creates very high visual stress.
Because it's so unnatural.
Yes, the cones in your eyes and the processing centers in your brain have to work incredibly hard to interpret that massive leap across the color spectrum. It is literally fatiguing to look at for long periods.
So a high contrast gradient is essentially screaming at the user. It's demanding maximum processing power, which makes the user feel stressed and overwhelmed, even if they don't consciously realize why they want to close the app.
Precisely. It drains them. But a subtle gradient, let's say a transition from a soft, calming cerulean blue to a slightly lighter, airy sky blue, well, it whispers.
It's gentle.
Very gentle. Because the two colors are so similar, they sit right next to each other on the color spectrum. The brain processes the transition between them with almost zero effort. It slides seamlessly from point A to point B. It dramatically reduces cognitive friction.
And because our brains absolutely love efficiency and hate wasting energy, we interpret that effortless processing as a positive emotion. We call it beautiful, we call it elegant or premium. It feels natural and calming just because it isn't fighting our biology.
That is the exact mechanism at play. You're designing for the biological comfort of the user.
Okay, I want to take all of this high-level psychology and biology and put it all the way down to the ground floor. Let's give our listeners some incredibly tactical, step-by-step execution strategies.
Practical application is key.
Right. If they have Figma open right now, how do they apply this? The text dives into the specific execution of button states. Let's talk about how the direction of the gradient physically changes the z-axis perception.
Let's start with the absolute classic, the vertical gradient. If you are designing a primary call to action button, and you put the lighter color at the top edge and a slightly darker color at the bottom edge, what physical scenario are you simulating?
I am basically faking the sun. I'm telling the user's brain that there is a light source coming from above the phone, hitting the top ridge of this physical button, and causing the bottom half of the button to fall into its own shadow.
Correct. You are creating a convex, three-dimensional shape. It looks raised. It physically protrudes toward the user, visually begging to be pushed down.
It looks ready.
Exactly. But let's say the user taps it. You need to design the active or press state of that button so the user knows their tap was registered by the system. How do you change the gradient to show that?
I would just invert it. I'd put the darker color at the top and the lighter color at the bottom.
Exactly. By simply reversing the gradient, you completely invert the 3D effect. The light is no longer hitting a raised top edge. The top edge is now in shadow because the button has been physically depressed down into the casing.
It looks totally concave.
Yes. With a simple swap of two colors, you have engineered a complete physical interaction on flat glass.
That is so incredibly elegant. It requires no animation, no heavy coding, just manipulating the math of light. What about diagonal gradients? When do we use those?
Diagonal gradients are excellent for achieving a highly polished organic look. The text strongly recommends starting at a safe 45-degree angle.
Why 45 degrees specifically?
Think about the real world again. Light rarely hits an object dead on from perfectly above or perfectly from the side.
Yeah.
It almost always strikes at an angle. A 45-degree slant mimics that casual, realistic environmental lighting. It feels much less rigid than a strict vertical transition.
And the text also mentions horizontal gradients, reading straight from left to right. Now earlier we said left to right loses that raised, 3D convex style. It doesn't simulate an overhead light. So why does the text say they are gaining massive popularity?
Because UI design is constantly evolving beyond strict skeuomorphism. While a horizontal gradient might lose a bit of that tactile z-axis depth, It gains dynamic motion.
Motion from a static color.
Yes. In Western cultures, we read from left to right. When a designer uses a vibrant horizontal gradient on a wide button, the color transition actively leads the eye across the text. It implies forward momentum and progression. It makes the button feel less like a physical chunk of plastic and more like a fluid gateway to the next step.
Okay, we're in the home stretch of this deep dive, and here's where it gets really interesting.
The cheat code.
Yes. If you've been listening and wondering, how do I actually pick two colors that are subtle and beautiful without just randomly guessing on the color wheel? The text provides a literal mathematical cheat code. It's a three-step method for creating the perfect soft gradient, and it relies entirely on using the HSB color model instead of RGB or hex codes. Can we break this down? Because this completely shifted how I view color selection.
It is a phenomenal, foolproof workflow. First, for context, HSB stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. While RGB mixes red, green, and blue light for screens, HSB aligns much closer to how humans actually organically perceive color.
So hue is the color, right?
Yes, hue is the actual color position on the 360-degree wheel. Saturation is how intense or washed out that color is. And brightness is simply how much black or white is mixed in.
Okay, so step one of the cheat code. The text says, create a linear gradient and apply the exact same color to both ends.
Yes, you start with a completely flat rectangle. Both ends of the gradient line are the exact same base color. Let's say it's a pleasant mid-tone seafoam green.
Got it. Step two, make sure your color picker is set to HSB mode. Select one end of your gradient and simply shift the hue value up or down by 15 to 30 points. Leave saturation alone, leave brightness alone. Just nudge the hue.
And this is exactly where the magic happens. Let's look at the math you were referencing earlier. The color wheel is 360 degrees. If you change the hue by 180 points, you jump to the exact opposite side of the wheel.
You hit that red to green clash.
Exactly. You hit that muddy complementary clash, but by only shifting it 15 to 30 points.
You are guaranteeing that the second color is an immediate next-door neighbor to your base color.
Precisely. You are staying entirely within an analogous color harmony. If your base is seafoam green, a 20-point shift might move you slightly toward a cooler cyan or slightly toward a warmer lime green. Because the saturation and brightness remain mathematically identical, the two colors share the exact same visual weight. They inherently belong together.
It removes all the guesswork. You aren't just staring at a massive spectrum trying to eyeball what looks good. You are literally just sliding the mathematical value, so the second color is a mathematically perfect cousin to the first.
It creates a mathematically guaranteed harmony. And the text offers a final step 3 to push it to absolute perfection. To make the effect even friendlier and softer, you rotate the gradient angle to 45 degrees and you drop the saturation of that second shifted color by about 10 to 15 points.
Wait, why drop the saturation? What does that do?
Dropping the saturation on one end slightly desaturates the hue, moving it closer to white or gray. It simulates atmospheric perspective. It makes the gradient feel airy and luminous rather than heavy and dense.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
In about 10 seconds, just following those 3 mechanical steps, a complete beginner can generate an incredibly professional, soothing, premium-looking soft gradient that drastically reduces cognitive friction.
It is mathematical beauty. It really is. And just when you think you've mastered the clean mathematical approach, the text throws in one last avant-garde pro tip that completely breaks the mold. It introduces the mesh gradient.
Mesh gradients are where UI design really borders on modern art. Instead of a simple linear or radial transition, a designer takes a shape and applies multiple intersecting radial gradients, often pushing the center points of those radials deep into the far corners of the rectangle.
Right, so instead of the single flashlight hitting the center of the wall, you have like 4 different colored flashlights hitting the 4 corners of the room, and the light from those 4 corners has to meet in the middle.
Exactly. It forces the soft, diffuse outer edges of those radial circles to crash into each other, blend, and bleed together in the center of the canvas. Because there are no hard lines anywhere, it creates highly unusual, completely organic atmospheric patterns.
It looks so dreamy.
It looks like out-of-focus macro photography, or a glowing nebulous aura. It is the ultimate evolution of the soft gradient complex, ethereal, and utterly impossible to mistake for a flat digital block.
It is stunning to look at in modern apps, and honestly, it perfectly encapsulates everything we've unpacked today. We started this journey by looking at the natural sky and acknowledging that human beings are fundamentally biologically wired to process gradients as a marker of depth and reality.
We need them to understand space,
We navigated through the dark ages of the early 2000s where hardware limitations turned our desire for realism into harsh, banded, skeuomorphic disasters.
We saw how that technological failure led to the sterile, flat design era before the hardware finally caught up, allowing for the beautiful resurrection of nuanced, mathematically precise, soft gradients.
We have thoroughly dismantled the idea that gradients are just a decorative coat of paint. They're a functional psychological necessity. They literally act as the z-axis on flat glass. They hack our proprioception to tell us exactly what is clickable.
They reduce cognitive friction to make interfaces feel beautiful.
Yes. And they allow brands to carve out infinite proprietary visual fingerprints in a world where all the primary colors are totally monopolized.
They are the vital bridge between the cold mathematical reality of a binary digital screen and the nuanced, organic, light-filled physical reality of the human visual cortex.
Absolutely beautifully said. Now, if you are a designer or even just someone fascinated by why the digital world looks the way it does and you found this breakdown insightful, you need to go directly to the source. This entire deep dive was completely based on the incredible insights from Chapter 11 of the book Design User Interface.
It is an essential text for understanding not just the how, but the profound why behind UI decisions.
We highly recommend you pick it up to really internalize these mechanics and philosophies. You can find it by going to the link https://hype4academy.gumroad.com/Lou-book. And to make it as frictionless as possible for you, you can buy the book by scanning the QR code of the book link provided in the description below. Also, we explicitly request that you follow the show for more technical design breakdowns and career-building content. We are obsessed with decoding these everyday interfaces, and having you join us on these deep dives makes the exploration completely worthwhile.
I do have one final thought, a provocation really, to leave you with as you head back to your design canvas. We have spent this entire hour discussing how to fake three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional, completely flat piece of glass.
Right.
We use gradients and shadows to simulate light that isn't really there, but the technology is shifting rapidly. We are moving into the era of spatial computing, augmented reality, and virtual reality headsets. The canvas is no longer flat.
Oh, wow. So the X and Y glass literally goes away.
Precisely. This raises an important question. How will our UI gradients evolve when the interface is physically suspended in 3D space? Will we stop faking depth with 2D color tricks and instead be forced to design actual volumetric gradients?
That sounds incredibly difficult.
Will you have to program glowing transitions of light suspended in thin air? And how on earth do you design a gradient when the user can physically walk around the interface and look at the back of it?
Man, volumetric light UI, that is an incredibly wild thought to chew on. The math is going to get a lot more complicated than just shifting the hue by 15 points, that's for sure. I cannot wait to see what you all design for that spatial future. To the listener, good luck on your design journey. Keep experimenting with those subtle hue shifts, trust your biology, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.